Coming up on Why Should I Trust You? So as you know on this show, we talk a lot about health, public health and MAHA, vaccines and RFK Jr., nutrition, and how all of it relates to the breakdown in trust. Today, we're going to talk about a different kind of health, the health of our information diet, what we consume, how we consume it, and whether the current media environment is so unhealthy, it's threatening not only our health, but the health of our democracy. It's no secret that trust in mass media has hit an all-time low. A new Gallup poll makes it crystal clear. The old top-down model of journalism, where a handful of outlets control the flow of information, has lost its authority. Today, we'll talk with three big names in this space, media thinkers who operate on the front lines of this new landscape. Astead Herndon, formerly of the New York Times and now at Vox. Emily Jashinsky of Breaking Points and recently a podcaster as part of Megyn Kelly's media universe. And Eliot Higgins, founder of the investigative collective Bellingcat. Eliot warns that in this new environment where people can no longer agree on basic facts or even what's true, democracy isn't just weakening, it's breaking down. So today, do we all agree we're in a crisis? And if so, what can we do to secure those information supply chains that are essential to a functioning democracy? And finally, is it possible that this new, more democratized media ecosystem, where individuals, not institutions, drive the flow of information, could ultimately lead us to a better, more trusted place? Let's get started. Welcome back, everyone.
Yeah, hey, everybody.
Hey, it's just Tom and me today. That's mainly because we are talking all things media today, and Tom and I are both veterans of the old media world. I mean, Mark is too, but I got to be honest, Mark and Maggie, we're going to give them the day to actually do their day jobs.
Just this once.
Just this once. We're going to let Mark be a doctor. We're going to let Maggie be a virologist. And Tom and I are going to do the media today. And I should say we're taping this on Monday, November 17th. So if something else happens this week, y'all are on your own. So in a moment, we're going to introduce you to our guests. I mentioned them in the intro. We're really excited to talk to them, Emily, Astead, and Eliot. But Tom, let's just chat and set the stage for our media trust discussion today.
Yeah. And, one of our guests, Eliot, talks at times about Walter Lippmann and his sort of view of media. So we go way back to the 20th century. And Walter Lippmann was a famous journalist. He was the founder of the New Republic. And he was a deep thinker about media. And he described media and mass media as a powerful gatekeeper. He had lots of thoughts about lots of different things, some controversial things, but putting that aside for a moment, let's just focus on this model that really was the way that things went for the 20th century into the 21st century, which is media is a powerful gatekeeper. It's an institution that counted, news and delivered news and shaped what he called the pictures in our heads. And this held, a small number of news organizations had the authority, had the voice, made the decisions, distributed to us. We received it. End of story. Obviously, over the past 15 or so years, everything has changed. Technologically, every which way life in the media world has changed. And this centralized model shatters. News and information and opinion no longer strictly flow top down. You could say it moves sideways, shared from one user to the next. Editors are no longer, the gatekeeper. We've got algorithms now playing a huge role in sort of sorting what we see or amplifying what we see. And informationally, we don't sort of all tune in at 6:30. We now live in these bubbles, and we've done whole episodes on this. But just this past month, we sort of got a peg for this episode, which is Gallup putting out its most recent number that gets at this breakdown in trust. And it found that only 28% of Americans today say they trust newspapers, television, and radio to provide accurate and fair information, like much of the time. And that's a record low. Just think about this. Just 4 years ago, that number was 40% trusted mass media. Now it's 28%.
That is nuts.
It's nuts.
It's funny because the two of us you would assume are just complete outliers in this poll because we come from mass media. That's how we got our training, so to speak. But I'm trying to figure out if I'm in that 28% who says that they trust mass media. And I mean, I'm just going by my behaviors. I read the New York Times. I look at Drudge. I look at, a ton of Substacks. And the truth is, if it goes by just the volume of what we consume, I am consuming way less mass media than I used to.
Yeah.
So I guess that means that's a trust thing. I don't know. I have to think about it.
Yeah, just, I think you can trust mass media, you can trust certain institutions, you can recognize that there are problems, there are biases, but still ultimately you trust these processes that, deliver news. But it's just a question is whether it's really relevant anymore. Like, are you, turning to Substack and podcasts and sort of leaving sort of these pipelines of mass media that we certainly lived in and worked in for decades.
100%. I mean, I'm definitely doing that.
Yeah.
And you were also finding, like, you found some numbers of just like the number of creators out there, and it kind of made my head explode.
I know. It's like there's 200 million content creators out there today, which is just an interesting number because
does that include like my next door neighbor who might make like a video about some?
No, I think this is a little bit more established than that. 2,000 news influencers who have more than 100,000 followers each. So you
2,000 news influencers who have more than 100,000 followers each. That's like the metric.
That's the metric. So again, it's just this breaking out and shattering and new shoots growing every day, every minute. Of content creation where you just don't need the big, media institutions anymore. So the question on the table is like, with that transformation, and as we move to this new decentralized model, what's going on with our trust? And I don't just mean like, do you trust legacy media? It's like, do we trust the same facts anymore? Do we trust science? Do we trust basic information? What's in that cone? Like what's in the sure, we do trust that, but once it gets out here, it turns a little bit more subjective, a little more opinion. Do we trust the study? Do we trust the jobs numbers? I mean, a lot of these things that were bread and butter, we trust them, all of a sudden those are being questioned. And that also brings us to sort of the institutions in our society that create some of these basic pieces of information. Do we trust those institutions? And as we'll discuss with our guests, there's lots of historic reasons certainly in our recent history why people have broken trust with institutions. They've lost trust.
Tom, when you and I were even thinking about doing this episode, we came upon something that Eliot Higgins of Bellingcat had written, this report that basically looks at what he and his co-author write as epistemic collapse. And I think that just got our brain, like it just fired up our brain synapses. Like what is epistemic collapse? Are we actually going through it? And is that what's at the root of this crisis of trust that we have? And that's what kind of wanted us to get this group of people together to talk about all this.
Yeah, it's so foundational, right? I mean, if you have epistemic collapse, I mean, essentially what you're saying is we are not sharing the same understanding of reality. Like just to put a phrase on it.
So with that, we're really excited to bring you this conversation with Emily Jashinsky, Astead Herndon, and Eliot Higgins. We'll take a quick short break and we'll be right back. Okay, welcome back. I'm really excited to welcome everyone to our show. Let's start with Eliot Higgins. He is the founder of Bellingcat, an investigative journalism site that specializes in open source intelligence, using publicly available information like online databases, government records, and social media to investigate events. He and Bellingcat are known for their work on the Russian government. And if any of you guys have seen that documentary about Alexei Navalny, there are some pretty badass moments between Bellingcat journalists who are basically like they found ways of getting the FSB agents to talk about their role in the poisoning. It's wild. You should really check it out. Bellingcat has done work on chemical weapons attacks in Syria, other major national stories. And in addition to reporting, Eliot Higgins is focused on scaling Bellingcat's methods among citizen journalists and teaching media literacy to help the next generation think more critically about what they see online. Welcome, Eliot.
Thanks for having me on.
Next, we have Astead Herndon, someone who really embodies this sort of duality of legacy and new media, but I'd say he's pretty fully in new media now. Astead was recently named editorial director and host with Vox, where he will, quote, launch and lead a new multi-platform video podcast for Vox, while also contributing political coverage across text, video, audio, and social media platforms. That's all. Before that, he was a national political reporter and a prolific podcaster for the New York Times. And Astead got his start in journalism on the Metro desk at the Boston Globe. Welcome to Why Should I Trust You, Astead?
Thank you. I'm glad to be here.
And finally, a friend and returning guest to the show, Emily Jashinsky. Emily is a young, modern-day conservative intellectual weighing in on our daily debates with an eye toward constitutional rights, values, and yes, media. And she's a lot going on, wearing many hats, including hosting After Party with Emily Jashinsky on YouTube, co-hosting Breaking Points, and writing as a columnist for Unheard. And she has a brand new gig in Megyn Kelly's media universe. She's going to be hosting a wrap-up show on Sirius. Welcome, Emily Jashinsky.
Thanks for having me.
So, guys, like we said, the goal of this conversation is to figure out whether we all agree that we are even in an information ecosystem crisis right now. If so, trying to diagnose the causes as well as we can, and what, if anything, we can do to pull ourselves out. And then if, that's a big if, we can get things back on track, could this new decentralized media landscape actually lead us to a more trustful place? Eliot, I want to read from the foreword of this recent essay you co-wrote, and the essay has a super catchy title, Verification, Deliberation, Accountability, a New Framework for Tackling Epistemic Collapse and Renewing Democracy. And you wrote it for a group called Demos, a democracy think tank. And in their foreword, they write, fake news, mis and disinformation are as old as democracies, but the democratic emergency we are now witnessing across the world is embedded in a new level of information crisis. And this is a really interesting phrase. You say the information supply chains that fuel our democratic processes are breaking down, corrupting and fragmenting to the point where people can no longer make good sense of the world around them. So basically, headline, Eliot, explain what you're seeing happening with our media today.
So really, it's a convergence of a few different factors. And for me, it really began with asking the question of, when we talk about people losing trust in institutions driving this disinformation crisis, what is that trust even based on in the first place? And really kind of digging into that. So verification, deliberation, and accountability is a framework I use to understand three core functions of democracy. That's verification is trying to find the truth. Deliberation is having spaces where we can actually discuss that stuff. And accountability is holding the powerful to account and making sure those things that we verify and deliberate on can actually have action taken on them. So it kind of simplifies our understanding of democracy down to those core functions. And we can understand those in the context of functional democracy, where those things are actually being achieved to an extent. Hollow democracy, where there's more performance of those functions, and a disordered democracy, where you have a simulation of those functions. And I think in this moment, we're moving towards a version that's more disordered because of a few key factors. One is the way we encounter information, we interact with information has changed dramatically. In the 20th century, those verification, deliberation, and accountability functions were performed by institutions, and they had a monopoly over the information that the public was able to see. And sometimes that worked, sometimes that didn't. But what's happened is we now live in a society where we have, rather than kind of a scarcity of information and a glut of attention, we have the reverse. We have a glut of information, but a scarcity of attention for that information. So we also have social media platforms that have become a primary source of information for people day to day, and they're driven by what's engaging rather than what's truthful. And what tends to be engaging is stuff that's emotionally engaging, and that means the information that we're now receiving and we're distributing to each other rather than through these institutions are really competing in this kind of marketplace of feelings. It's what gets attention is what people pay attention to because the algorithm is serving it to them. And that is that generally more negative, emotionally engaging content. So it skews the entire information system. And it also means that the public are competing in the same spaces for attention as these traditional institutions are. So that kind of turns the whole world over on its head and kind of flattens it at the same time. And I think this is kind of, the basis of this information crisis we're actually living through at the moment.
Yeah, I mean, Astead and Emily, do you guys agree with the kind of diagnosis of us being in this, epistemic collapse, the collapse of these information supply chains? I want to go to you, Astead. Like, does that ring true for you and what you're seeing?
Yeah, definitely. I think that we have seen information both become siloed, decentralized, as we've talked about, but I would even go further to say there's a step away from trust. I think there's an active distrust of traditional information ecosystems. I think, I've seen, the institutions that used to be those gatekeepers, those verifiers, and I think took an identity as that as well. I don't think play that same level of role. I don't think play that same narrative agenda setting, nor do I think that's all bad. I think that, there's a lot of ways that those gatekeepers lost trust in an earned way, and so I think the pandemic marks the kind of formal break with this. And I think we see in health and media and other places, people preferring someone in their own ecosystem to be a recommender more than health professional, right? I saw some stats on this from Edelman recently. And so I think that is true across a lot of different places. But the point I want to make is I would even go further than to say it's a passive step back from these places, more than it is in a lot of ways. I've talked to particularly like electorate voter lens, an active sense that these gatekeepers have misled you. And so your choice away from that structure, your choice to more independent media, your choice to more individual content creator is an active one.
Emily, what's your take on this? Talk to me about what goes through your head when you hear the phrase epistemic collapse.
Well, I like the use of the word epistemic because it harkens to Neil Postman writing about the epistemology of television versus the epistemology of print. And when you think about the epistemology of TikTok and you compare that to television and to print, it's quite obvious that the way, the mechanisms of delivery for information, as Postman would argue, are delivering entertainment, but in a even different way than television. I mean, what Postman was horrified by the 1980s and the Reagan presidency, where you have an actor becoming president. I mean, imagine, this is a host of Celebrity Apprentice becoming president, right? Because social media made him a master of that medium. And so, yeah, I think one of the points that Astead just made that's really important is some of the earned distrust. But does that mean the new media sources have earned trust? Not necessarily. I think actually what we're looking at is just distrust across the board and people sort of starting to pick and choose based on what feels most authentic. So there's a little bit of good to this new epistemology, which is that everything is on, vertical video. You don't even need to have high production anymore. It just looks authentic. It looks like something anybody could deliver from their iPhone. At the same time, of course, that means anybody can deliver this information from their iPhone and have the same mechanism that used to be the print version of the Milwaukee Journal-Sentinel, my hometown paper. The barrier to entry to look exactly like what the Milwaukee Journal-Sentinel is putting out, if it's vertical video on TikTok, anybody could do it. So there's good and there's bad, but it's definitely a totally new epistemology. And I think the more that we acclimate ourselves or condition ourselves to think about media as an epistemology and the technological delivery systems of media as creating an epistemology, the better off we'll be.
Eliot, you talked a bit in this essay about how individuals are getting swamped with information. They can't make sense of it. They start to break down, their trust in it. But I also want to talk about the institution piece of this too, because as we move into more dangerous phases of democracy, one of them is people, Americans, in our example, look at institutions. They look at the CDC. They look at the DOJ. Institutions that, sort of did an okay job, sort of didn't do a great job. But at the end of the day, you sort of believed what they were pumping out. You believed the information that they were disseminating. COVID, Astead mentioned COVID. But in our road to this breakdown in trust, there were other big things that happened. And I just want to do a tiny piece of history of how we got to this thing that we're sort of describing as a crisis now. You could point to the weapons of mass destruction not being found in Iraq. You could talk to folks about the financial crisis and sort of who got punished there and who wasn't held accountable and who got bailed out. But Eliot, do you want to just take us a little bit back in history as to how we got to this precarious place?
Well, one thing I talk about in that work is the idea of counterpublics. And these are formations in the public that form in response to what is perceived to be injustices. And when that was first coined as a phrase, it was more about things like the civil rights movement, for example. What I talk about are counterpublics that are functional, hollow, and disordered. And what drives a lot of that disordered counter-public discourse is the fact there have been those betrayals of trust. That hollowness has been recognized in democracy, or, the betrayal. Iraq is a very good example of that. But also what's lacking are real world spaces where people can come together and organize, because those have been hollowed out over the years. Unions have kind of reduced their membership. There's less, union hall membership, for example. The dropping the attendance to churches in certain parts of the world, I think, is also a big driver behind that. Social spaces where people can come together and start organizing around certain issues. But we've also had, decades and decades of those very, public perception of betrayal. I think Iraq, for me, is actually one of the really biggest moments in 2003, because I've done a lot of work on things like chemical weapon use in Syria, for example, and dealt a lot with the denialist community there. And every single time it's just Iraq all over again, WMDs, it's the same thing happening again. So it gives them a kind of permission structure to deny what's happening in Syria because it doesn't fit their worldview. Then they find people online who share similar views, who are already sharing content that reinforces those views. So they're saying, see, lots of people agree with me. And they're drawn into these online bubbles that, we talk about all the time. But what's really important there, it's not just about exposing them to the views they already hold, but more extreme versions of those views. It's kind of like, a few years back, you might type in, are COVID vaccines safe? And you might see results that say, well, vaccines, if you take them all at once, can cause illnesses, because of additives in them, like mercury, something that RFK Jr. is a big believer in. But then when you start engaging with that content and the communities related to that, you'll get slightly more extreme content saying that vaccines actually make you sick. And then vaccines are designed to make you sick by Big Pharma. And then, Bill Gates wants to put microchips into those vaccines. And eventually 5G towers are going to turn on and turn you into zombies. And this results in, 5G towers being burnt down in the UK by people who really believe this stuff. Not every single person is going to go on that journey, but once you've had that initial seed of distrust, that can be kind of grown through these online communities, these algorithms, into something more serious. And that's usually based on the individual's life experiences, the traumas that they've had, where that distrust is coming from. And we haven't really got a handle on that at all, because I think there's a tendency to treat these platforms as almost a neutral space, a kind of marketplace of ideas, where really it's a marketplace of feelings now.
Astead, how do you kind of put all that together? We've got institutions that have failed in certain big dramatic ways, and we have this incredible environment of social media now that is there to kind of, pick up the pieces and bring you to a new place. I mean, how do you see how we got to this place?
I mean, I would really agree with the kind of timeline that was just laid out. I feel like there are both institutional factors that have driven this here. And I think that earned distrust is important. The second piece I would say from that is not acknowledging that earned distrust is important. I feel like our instinct, particularly someone who comes from a mainstream media, place, has often been to lecture people out of that. And I think we only kind of took that more seriously as it became unavoidable, particularly, I think, on the right and things. But I always point back to the ways I had to overcome this, particularly in like a field day-to-day reporting way, was originally with Black communities in Boston who hated the newspaper for only showing up for murders and fires, which was an accurate description of their relationship to that place. I mean, getting over those steps were things that were been, if you do the kind of work I do that prioritizes people who were marginalized, you've always been dealing with that distrust. And so my frustration and our unwillingness to see that has boiled over, which I think was we didn't have the tools to really respond to that distrust as it became more applicable, I think, across a lot of people.
Instead, I want to play out for me what it would have looked like to actually listen to distrust. Like, what would that even have looked like in 2003 America?
Well, I'm going to kind of skirt the question because I guess I wasn't really saying, I'm saying once you have those, I agree about Iraq is formative. I'm saying, but once you have those moments of kind of mass failure, that's what you should be reacting to. And so in my universe, I think political, electoral politics version of Iraq might be 2016 election. And so I come out of that saying, part of that is the same issue. We took a view of the country that was completely driven by top-down candidates, by kind of DC insiders, by like a kind of pollster, a collective agreement about the ways certain demographic changes were moving and things like that. So my point is, if you don't come out of that election and step away from the wheel and say, maybe the assumed ways we thought the growth of Latino voters is wrong. Maybe the ways we were applying our lens on African-American voters to immigrant communities is wrong. Like that to me is you not learning your last lesson of your sourcing. I think you could apply that to how much do we quote an IDF that has not sold the truth in repeated instances, right? Like how much do we quote a whole bunch of foreign governments and so I'm saying that to me is, I'm not really using, it's not, I guess I'm like not too young to feel like I have the context for 2003 itself.
Fair enough.
When you have those instances, for you not to respond to me is you failing journalistically.
Emily, do you want to jump in? What's your take on what Astead just said?
I think so much of this is downstream of class biases in newsrooms, and that's kind of an obvious point, not necessarily an epistemological one, but it's one that's important because the average news consumer, I mean, the biggest bias in media is working in media, and that's because the way you consume what you deliver is so completely different from your average news consumer. And I think that creates a sort of mystification about what distrust in media actually is when you're somebody who recognizes, most of the bylines you read and knows the inner workings of the papers and has read every single story in the daily TikTok of X on your timeline leading up to the story you read. It's just a completely different experience from your average or even your median news consumer. And a lot of the, I think, a lot of the problems in newsrooms is that they have so much more trust in media than especially people who are less affluent, so like lower than bachelor's degrees, lower annual income. That is just a totally different news consumption experience than most people in coastal enclaves have, and that is why newsrooms were caught off guard in 2016 and 2020 during the pandemic, and then 2024. It's just been, those are like the formal, as Astead said, moments of departure where we can say that this marked a new epoch or a new era. But for a lot of people in the rest of the country, they weren't surprised by many of those developments. So it's, on that note, it's obvious, I think there's just still this big gulf, but the commercial incentives point is relevant too. What is the commercial incentive of TV, of TikTok, of cable versus print? Well, I actually don't know that it's entirely different. You have a little bit more time to be thoughtful in print, and you have you're writing for somebody who is not passively consuming. But at the same time, it's selling papers, and that's going to be with us no matter what.
So, Eliot, media as a mainstream institution, did it fail to hold it to account other institutions in our life, a la the run up to the Iraq War? Did it fail to recognize sort of a different American landscape of voters, a la the 2016 election? I mean, how much did mainstream media fail, and how that led to where we are right now?
I think it was more apparent in the recent election rather than 2016, how the mainstream media and I think the Democratic establishment assumes that we are still playing the 20th century game of information, that, they were the only authority in what was being said about the election. So they missed this whole online ecosystem that I think really dominated a lot of the information system during that election. I think the failure to recognize that, the importance of that, led to basically one side doing a terrible job of engaging with the electorate. And I think there are other issues at place. We can't just blame it on, the information system was unfair on one side or another and they didn't understand it. But I think it is different from the situation we had in 2003 because we didn't have really those same social media online sources that we had in any way. You have that kind of blogosphere that's emerged independently of the media that did play a role in the public understanding of what was happening in terms of WOD and Iraq. But you didn't have the social media systems that we have over the last 10 years that have really driven a lot of discourse around topics. And again, that discourse rewards outrage over truth. And that's the problem I think we have with a lot of political discourse. If you're looking at the UK at the moment, one huge issue at the moment is the Labour Party's handling of immigration issues and asylum issues. And that seems to be really driven by the fact that this is really a topic that's pushed by social media platforms because it is what engages people. I think immigration as a topic more broadly is something that it is something that lots of people engage with, either on kind of the, reacting to some of the more authoritarian moves that we're seeing both in the UK and US, or those who support that because they believe that there's a real risk from that. But it creates almost a situation where, because I think a lot of political parties now are less driven by traditional ideologies than trying to build a coalition of voters so they can hold power and basically become middle managers of the country. They don't really have a strong ideology, so they end up chasing voters from other parties, like in the UK Reform, a right-wing party that is very anti-immigration, who are doing very well in the polls, but all they do is actually undermine their own base. And this is because I just don't think they understand the information environment they actually are operating in truly. And I think until parties start really understanding this isn't something where you can, put an opinion piece in a newspaper and everyone will read it and react to it. It's something where you have a constant stream of just people engaging with each other on this very kind of emotional, feelings-driven level that doesn't really allow for deliberation to take place, that there's no space now to discuss these things because it's always on to the next thing and everyone's always angry at each other. And that makes real accountability possible. So you end up just with this performance of politics where it's like, you're trying to attract voters to your cause, but without no real ideology underpinning that anymore. And I think that puts democracy on pretty bad footing.
So, Eliot, you just said two things that I find really interesting. One is the outcome of what happens in these ecosystems, but I want to go back to this point of the media class not being reflective of the people that they're covering, and that there being this disconnect between kind of what they think are the stories and what, like, the idea that the media's biggest bias is the media. Emily, that really, like, a little light bulb went off in my head for that. But instead, like, let's dig into that even a little bit more, which is that, are we saying, is it like the professional managerial class has happened to media? Is that what we're saying? Like, the thing that people say about, quite frankly, the Democratic Party, they say a lot about public health. Is that what's at play here?
Well, somewhat. I think that I would combine the last 2 points. I think it's not just about the blind spots of the media class. I think it's a blind spot about even the consumer too, right? Like the bias itself. There's a class tension in information ecosystems. And so by the nature of what we do at particularly a New York Times, you are self-selecting a certain type of reader, certain type of consumer. And I think that box is shrinking and shrinking, right? Like there's a fight between the Times and Substack, but the real issue is that the few amount of people broadly who are consuming information in that form. And so I definitely think that has truth to it. But I also think that there is a more like, there were some identities, there were some blind spots that were prepared to matter and have always mattered. I've come up in like, my relationship to media is also one where I never saw the Times or mainstream media as a place of infallibility, right? Like, it doesn't take having one of those big moments, because the story, particularly I think as someone who comes up in like Black and like church communities and like civil rightsy legacy, the story is about them not getting the story, right? So I'm like, the idea that the place missed big things and changes in this country was one I grew up with, was one that was obvious to me, right? They were always a vehicle for good or bad. They were always could expose an injustice or placate one, right? Like, both of those things exist as possibilities. What I would say is, like, when I got there, I was prepared for some identities to matter. I think, age, race, maybe like I went to Marquette. We talk about Wisconsin here. I'm kind of Midwestern. And so, but I would really say, like, there was a like elite obsession with college, with like Ivy League, like myopicness, with
You're saying at the Times.
I'm saying in mainstream media in general. I would say like elite media in general. I think the Times is reflective and a driver of that. But like, that blew my mind. I think there was a blind spot to people of faith. I think there was a blind spot to like, I come from a place where an evangelical is not crazy, right? Like, and there was like, sometimes I would see like that idea as othered in wild ways too. And so I don't though think we can separate this from some of the legitimate pieces of the 2020 movements about racial diversity and equity that we saw too. It's just that my version of DEI and fairness always included talking to said Trump voter or talking to other person too. And I think there was way too much ideological rigidity in how people were somewhat seeing that. And there was way too much class blindness in how people were seeing those phrases. But I'm like, it is completely true that the country we were trying to serve, even the city in covering the Zoran race, I mean, the Times is not a place where a lot of people take public transit. The Times is not a place where a lot of people are renters. Like this is, you're having a higher amount of people who
the Times doesn't take public transit. Like, come on now.
I'm saying the Times is a place, has a lot of people. So it does take a lot of public transit. I'm saying you have a lot, the further you get up, the further you get to New Jersey. The further you get up, the further you get to car owners, like as with all places, right? And so I'm saying like, it's not shocking to me that it exists outside of a movement happening in the city that is not that reflective of where most of those people live still. And so I'm saying like there's a Brooklyn-y hipstery element to the place that I think is whatever, but that's not who is setting narratives there. And so when we talk about the class divides within media, I think the Times is one example of that, but I'm on CNN panels every day that sound ridiculous compared to like people's day-to-day experience.
Wait, tell me more about that, Astead. Please tell me more about that. Why does it sound ridiculous compared to people's
experience? Not even an insult to CNN. I'm really saying like, I've thought of this for years. I remember when they were doing the first Trump impeachment and I was on the road talking to people and I get back and I'm like, I have no clue what you all are talking about. I have no clue what y'all are talking about. Like, there's so many instances like that where the DC brain starts frying over something that nobody cares about. And then they miss stuff that everybody cares about, like Epstein or Biden's obvious decline, So I'm saying like there will be these things where you can feel the out of whackness. And all I'm saying is that relies on you, I think, to Eliot and Emily's point, having touchstones with the information ecosystem that is diverse. And I mean that in a legitimate way and in a class-driven way too.
All right. You mentioned Epstein, so we have to go.
All right,
there.
you said it, Astead.
We have to go.
Now
there.
we got to go there.
It's interesting to think about the Epstein story. In Eliot's essay, he lays out 3 stages for democracy. And I'm wondering if we can think about the Epstein story and how it's playing out right now in America through the prism of these stages and pick which stage we think we're in. So the first stage is substantial, which is voices are heard, the powerful is held to account, institutions aren't perfect but functioning. Then you move into the performative stage, which is the rituals of democracy carry on but feel like a performance. Institutions act, but trust in them is thin, and politics feel hollow. And then we get to the bad one, which is disordered, which the rituals exist, but they're inverted. So we have like scapegoating is presented as accountability, or propaganda is somehow presented as like verification. So basically these institutions we're like imitating the rituals of democracy, but we're actually weaponizing institutions. If you think about the Epstein story and where we are and how our institutions have handled it, where do we think we are? Emily, what would you say? How are we doing with Epstein? And is that an example of like how we're moving more into sort of a media information democracy crisis?
Well, part of what Marshall McLuhan wrote about was that the technologies themselves, so I'm thinking of Epstein as particularly being something that exploded in the TikTok era. The delivery mechanisms themselves are going to change what we talk about, not just how we talk about it, not just, you're driving a sedan versus an SUV metaphorically, but actually like what you are doing with your vehicle. And so I think with the Epstein story, it is very much a function of the TikTok era. And part of what makes that interesting is TikTok, because you can go a little bit longer than, for example, Vine or what Instagram used to let you do or what Twitter used to let you do, you can start telling stories. And it's individuals with low production and a lot of sort of homegrown research. And I feel like that has been jet fuel on the Epstein story, because TikTok has, I think, fostered this community of people who are like independent researchers, and then they go on YouTube, and there's some overlap between that, but in ways that are very positive and in ways that are very concerning, because it's just all kinds of stuff. It's the Charlie Kelly meme from It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia with Pepe Silva, where he's trying to draw a million different lines between a million different little scraps of information. So is it pushing, on the one hand, the government closer to some type of disclosure? Apparently, right now, the answer to that question is yes. It looks like the pressure is such that even as we speak here, a president who has been very resistant to pushes for further disclosure, because members of his own party, like Marjorie Taylor Greene and Thomas Massie, who are masters of the new media format, have actually created a pretty, not created, but responded to a pretty organic bottom-up demand for more transparency from the man who says he could shoot somebody on Fifth Avenue and still be okay with the voters. It's also a testament to him being responsive to new media as well, and at least having the instincts to say, this is something that's real, as opposed to, this is just, this will pass. So there's all kinds of stuff going on right now. Maybe it's a function of my age, but I also always feel like the description of the second category, Eliot's second category, to me, that just seems like where democracies have always been. It's hard.
That's like our operating system. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. It's hard for me to connect with a time where it wouldn't have been like that, even historically. So it still feels like that's where we are, but it feels like maybe we're slipping from that position.
So, Eliot, is the Epstein example, does that reveal a disordered democracy, or are there green shoots of optimism that, power, the people are speaking up to the institutions and moving them in a healthier direction?
Well, you can use the framework to analyze individual institutions, even individuals within those institutions. So I think a good example of how those verification, deliberation, and accountability functions are kind of inverted by disordered institutions is the way in which Trump has ordered this investigation of people mentioned in the Epstein files or who are on the other side of the aisle. It's not about people on his side or, people he likes. So it's that targeted accountability. It's about the out-group being targeted and the in-group being protected. But I think there's been such a huge amount of pressure. It's very, very hard for Trump. And we've seen today that he wants the files released now to kind of ignore this issue. I think Marjorie Taylor Greene, people like Kash Patel as well, they represent what I would call part of the kind of MAGA disordered counter to public coalition. It's I think important for people to understand that MAGA isn't just one movement. It's actually a group of different movements that see kind of Trump as a way to get what they want. If RFK Jr., which you and your listeners know a lot about, he represents this alternative health movement. You have Kash Patel and Dan Bongino, who are more from this kind of Pizzagate kind of, sex crime truth movement. You have people like Tulsi Gabbard, who are more from the kind of, chemical weapons in Syria conspiracy community. They all represent different communities. And this is actually, I think, a bit of a crisis moment for that coalition, because those people who are voting for Trump because they think that he's going to be, revealing what's happening in the Epstein files are getting a very, very different delivery from what they expected. And for them, Trump is not the ultimate goal of this. Revealing the truth behind what they believe is, this huge cover-up is the main thing. But they were very much coming from the perspective that it was a lot of Democrats involved, and now there's more and more information about Trump and this, clear refusal to release the files and this performance over the last several months of, files being released, but it's stuff that's already out in the public, and pro-Trump podcasters being given binders full of stuff that's already in the public has, to them, I think, really revealed this hollowness of the kind of promise that was given to them. So I think in this instance, you're seeing, at least within the White House, a very disordered form of democracy, but you are seeing other institutions, the media in particular, doing a pretty good job of doing the more functional side of this. We can have these multiple different systems acting, in institutions with each other and against each other. And I think really what we're seeing is a more disordered form, within the White House at the moment.
I was just going to say that I think this is a rare instance where Trump looks inauthentic. Like you can't actually pin that on him and on a lot of things, because even in his willingness to ideologically flip flop, it's kind of transparent, all of that type of stuff. This is the opposite of that. This is a powerful man hiding secrets, but for him and his powerful friends. And so I think that it makes sense to me that not only is this the issue that the internet has latched on from, but this is the issue that has caused legitimate tension with him and that crew that mostly has liked him as a kind of bull in China shop against an inauthentic political class. And so, in some ways, I think it's reflective of our broad, of the kind of themes we're talking about. And in some ways, it's just old fashioned politics, where the thing that is his quality that people like him for is threatened by scandal. And so, I think that Donald Trump took a long time to recognize the threat that this represented to him. And I think that it's going to have lasting impacts, partially because it speaks to a thing that he's actually not, it speaks to a conflict he's not really had, which is creating that inauthenticity among that medium that craves it so much.
Eliot, you wanted to say something.
Yeah, so I would just also add that I think what is unusual about this is the danger is coming from within the kind of in group rather than the out group, because when it comes from the out group, it's easier to ignore. They're just saying up to the woke media or the left or whatever. But when it's your own supporters turning against you like this, and it's coming from the in group, I think that's when it's really, really dangerous to Trump, because this is not something he's had to really deal with in a significant way before.
Yeah, and I want to actually talk about some of the structural things at play here too, because I think you guys have done a really nice job talking about the politics of it. And I want to talk about the fact that in some ways, Trump, look, back in 2015, in 2016, the way he used Twitter was revolutionary. I think we can all recognize that. I mean, I think in many ways has created the modern day culture of politicians having a direct conversation with their constituents and hearing all the things that they may have to say about that. I guess my question is, in a way, is this Epstein thing kind of his own making, simply because he created an infrastructure where people feel so emboldened that he will give them answers, because he always said he would, that this could never have happened with anyone else, in a way, Emily, that you hear this all the time, right? Like that he'll kind of test run something, and based on how people are responding to it, he'll adjust. It's like the classic minute by minute television producer. Like that's what we used to do in the newsroom, that if somebody in the audience didn't like something, you'd adjust the story. Emily, I'm saying a couple of things right now. I hope it makes sense, but just what are your thoughts?
No, I mean, yes, that's his, I guess, political genius, and maybe as you could even call it a media genius, is he used these kind of trial balloon posts on X, and really he could only be elected, I really believe, in a low institutional trust environment, because what he does is tell you that everybody else is not worthy of your trust, and by doing that, people then ascribe to him a level of trustworthiness that, they might not trust him 100%. I think it's a fairly small portion of the country that's actually a rally-going, diehard Fifth Avenue MAGA person. But when you tell everyone else correctly that the other institutions have failed in this way, that way, and the other way, then you innately have this level of trustworthiness. And he has, I think, always understood that, which is, in some sense, why the way that he's handled the Epstein case is interesting, because he sort of stoked those rumors. There are clips going around the internet right now, not rumors, but he stoked intrigue over the story when he was originally talking about the Clintons, for example. And then it kind of got away from him because in this new media environment where TikTok isn't just, I think he had this impression because TikTok was helpful to him as he saw it in 2024, that, all these content creators were anti-democrat when it's just everybody is in these spaces now. And TikTok theories about Trump and Epstein. are rampant. And I think that's where Marjorie Taylor Greene is a very, very interesting example of somebody who is difficult for mainstream media outlets to deal with because of how she comes from just like a very normal background of your Trump supporter who is a small business owner in the suburbs of Atlanta, who is a woman that was, getting, as she's talked about, deep into Facebook conspiracy theories about the Rothschilds and other things. Like, that is so normal. And it makes sense that some normal human being who is having, as she has discussed, this normal relationship in a low institutional trust environment where things are spreading on social media that stoke ideas in her own mind that she goes to Congress, realizes were over her skis. She gave this speech on the floor of the House in 2021 that is so fascinating about exactly how she was seduced by some of these different conspiracy theories. And she was just upset, and her small business was hurting because of what had happened after the Affordable Care Act. And it was just easy for her to get sucked into this world. And so for her to be the one that pushes Trump so hard that he kind of takes a pivot on the Epstein files is almost poetic, as an example of how actors in this low institutional trust environment are operating, and how Trump is sometimes ahead of it, but then also sometimes behind it.
Right. That phrase that, somebody like Trump could only operate in a low institutional trust environment, that really is interesting to me, Astead, because, you've covered Zohran Mamdani, for instance, right? And in many ways, I think you may even have said this in your piece for The Times when I think you find way more parallels to him and Trump than you do to him and Kamala Harris, for instance, in terms of how they interact with the public. And from my perspective in the show we cover, or the topics we cover, I look at Trump, Mamdani, and RFK Jr. as having a very similar kind of a vibe with their people, with how they communicate to people. And I guess what I would say instead is therein lies the solution in a way. Like, sure, we're talking about Epstein, we're talking about conspiracies and all this stuff, but is there something to actually learn from these folks about how they're communicating in a low institutional trust environment?
Yeah, I certainly think there is. I think that, Donald Trump is a expert diagnoser of problems, of societal problems. He does quite well at saying this is not working and acknowledging that places in society have not worked for people and that there are legitimate reasons for that distrust. Now, where he has, aired, I think, in public opinion or whatever is in democracy, whatever is in the solution building from that. But I mean, the reason he continues to have staying power is in that diagnosis. In a lot of places where I think Democrats and political establishment wouldn't, Zoran works from that same premise. He is not, as Democrats were kind of in power in the 2021-22 moment, telling people to not believe their eyes when they came to immigration and not believe their wallets when it became to inflation. Zoran was, going door to door in Bay Ridge, talking about the ways that the party has failed working class people of color and working class immigrants, right? So that is his natural language, is to come from a place where those traditional structures have not supported you, and what are you building around that? I think about RFK Jr. as someone whose diagnoses a political system at both sides being inadequate, fits for your ideology as very important. I mean, we met so many of the people who track their Maha to MAGA journeys. We interviewed RFK Jr. and talked to him about kind of his own journey from kind of radicalizing on democratic overreach as the most important thing. But does that mean that people don't think big pharma and corporate capture are real issues? No, they really do. And so, I do think that the through line that we see between those people is in the things that they're willing to name, particularly that establishment is not willing to do. And so, as someone who interviewed Harris and all those other folks, they are kind of weather vaning a ideology in the moment. And I think that this both in what we're talking about in terms of the mediums and information structures that drive conversation right now, do not allow that to happen, you know? And so what I would say is, I don't think that means you have to be far left or far right. And I hate those phrases. I'm using them, whatever. But I do think you have to have a clarity of beliefs. I do think you have to have a clarity of message. Even someone like Gavin Newsom can thrive in this environment because he has a clarity that I think someone like Harris has not had. And so I don't think it has to be a specific place from an ideological spectrum. But when I'm at that Mamdani rally and he says, we're going to make buses, and the crowd calls back free, and we're going to make childcare free, and we're going to make, what's the third promise? Rent freeze, right? Like, that's a type of engagement I've only seen at Build the Wall, you know? Like, or probably RFK Jr. had some vibes like that too. But I'm saying, what would the call and response been for Joe Biden? You know, no one was calling out for the
just
CHIPS
made me
Act.
laugh.
You know, like what was it? You should think through it. Like, what was that going to be? And
Infrastructure.
I'm saying he's engaged in the act of mass politics in the way that I think Donald Trump is too. And so that's what I think the through line you're seeing between those people are.
Yeah, and I'm going to go to Emily next in a second. I just want to just boost what you're saying, because even in our audience, and we have a fair number of our audience who are Maha supporters, one of the things that I hear them say a lot is that even just naming the thing that you mistrust is so powerful, because the very act of mistrusting is it builds trust. It's weird,
it's like a currency.
Yeah. And if you don't talk in that language, they think you're hiding something.
You're not in reality. You're not in where it's
or you're somehow defending.
That's what I'm saying. And so even, the way this works in the Zoran specific example is they would say, that he did not have, it's not that he was going place to place talking about his Palestinian advocacy, but that in an environment where Democrats felt that their leaders were not talking about something, the fact that he did gain trust on said other issues. So it was the currency among them that allowed them to believe that he was serious about landlords, or he was serious about all this other stuff. I think amongst communities, there's a lot of different of those kind of gateway style trust issues where if you are not clearing the barrier, I think COVID was a huge one here. But I'm like, if you're not clearing the barrier on acknowledging where those folks' distrust comes from, then they're not even going to hear you, even on things they might agree with you with otherwise.
Boom. Emily Jashinsky, you wanted to add something.
Yeah, so, that's really similar to what I was going to say. I don't know if folks have noticed that CBS, for example, has started putting out more and more transcripts of interviews. And this was something that I thought was really obvious that was going to happen after Kamala Harris and Donald Trump. Well, Donald Trump attacked 60 Minutes for what he said and then ended up in a lawsuit was the selective editing of a Kamala Harris answer on Israel-Palestine before the 2024 election. And what the public saw was indeed a discrepancy between the video and the transcript. Now, if you work in media, you saw that discrepancy and basically shrugged. You were like, this is the norm. This is how 60 Minutes works. This is exactly what production of these glossy, high-profile interviews looks like. You couldn't possibly just air it without making some of these judgments. But today, in 2024, that landed in a way that infuriated people, seemed completely abnormal, and as though it was something that CBS should be not trusted for having done. And what was interesting is since then, they have started putting out more and more transcripts. I think that's actually a fantastic trend. Let's get all of the transcripts, even if you can only fit on the sort of linear television format a certain part of the interview. Let's get all the transcripts. I mean, there's something with accountability in that. There's something with authenticity in that. But the point that Astead was making about candidates themselves, Kamala Harris in the transcript doesn't look much better than in the edited portion of the 60 Minutes interview. And that I just think speaks to, you need to have candidates who are able to seem normal, authentic, speaking the right kind of language, fluent in institutional distrust, and not just kind of gesturing at it.
That's so interesting, Emily. It's like put forward candidates who you can hold up in a transcript is
exactly.
really interesting.
That's exactly it.
Tom, you had something to
Yeah, just I wanted to bring Eliot in on this idea of like our breakdown of what's factual, what's true. Like we see it on this show all the time. Like I don't trust that CDC number, or you have a study, well, I have a different study, or we see it in the jobs numbers. Like Trump didn't like the jobs numbers and said these numbers are wrong, but a lot of our economy is pinned to these numbers and have been pinned to these numbers. How do we get ourselves out of this mess? You know, that Emily had made a great point about releasing transcripts. Like, here's the source material. Go at it, you know, world. I heard you say in a talk that the approach since 2016 has been to sort of fact check our way out of this, and that just won't work. So if you talk about sort of restoring people's faith in basic information, basic numbers, how do we do that? How do we get there?
Well, I think it very much has to begin in education. It has to be based around critical thinking skills becoming really embedded in our education system, along with media literacy skills. One thing that people have to really recognize is the information system we exist in nowadays is very different from that 20th century top-down gatekeep system, because those gatekeepers were the distributors of information. Now we're the distributors of information. What we see and what we choose to share affects lots of people. It doesn't just affect them directly in terms of what they're seeing, but what the algorithm learns about what people want to see. You know, we don't understand as individuals, we want to have that responsibility to each other when we're using those social media channels. So that's, you know, when I'm talking about media literacy, that's kind of one area I'm talking about, and why it has to be something that involves everyone, not just people who want to become journalists, because we're all distributors of information now. In terms of critical thinking skills, you know, we need to be able to understand the information that we're seeing and assess it. I think because we're doing such a bad job of teaching that to people, that when it comes to these disordered communities forming, the drivers behind that they're seeing information that reinforces what they believe, and they don't really know how to question that information or even think about questioning that information, is something that draws them deeper into that. In the UK, there's actually been, there was a House of Lords report on this issue that said that critical thinking skills, media literacy was actually essential for democracy. And the UK government's actually just published a strategy on its education strategy that does put critical thinking skills and media literacy at the center of that. So there is that recognition that there is important. And just going back to your earlier point about, you know, that post-2016 period, there's been far too much focus, not just on the idea that we can kind of have a million fact-checking websites and that'll fix everything, but this is an issue that is primarily about foreign actors influencing our domestic citizenry. It's not that. That's just part of a much, much broader information system issue. And if we aren't thinking about it in terms beyond that, then we're always going to be stuck playing basically whack-a-mole with disinformation, and that'll never change those underlying causes. There's a lot of other work that needs to be done beyond education. A lot of it is building kind of civic capacity to actually engage citizens in the democratic process beyond just voting. We're in a way always engaged in the democratic process now if we're on these platforms, because that's what's defining the epistemic environments that everyone else is seeing. So, you know, it's tricky to kind of sell that to governments when there's so much pressure on education systems already that you have to do this whole new thing and think about education in a new way. But we live in a whole new information system, and we need to not hope we can go back to a 20th century system, but evolve into something that's useful and functional in democracy, because at the moment we are not in a functional form of democracy. We're barely in a hollow form, and we're certainly moving towards a disordered form at great speed.
And you guys at Bellingcat are working with, like, correct me if I'm wrong, but like thousands of citizen journalists, trying to empower them to jump into the fray, to highlight like a deep fake video, or to report on something that, you know, if something is put out into the ecosystem that's fake and false, to jump on it right out of the gate to knock it down, right? I mean, that's part of what you guys are doing.
Yeah, education is a really big part of the work we're doing. And part of that is training journalists, activists, people at NGOs in workshops. And we train probably over 10,000 people like that now. We also create our own online communities. So we have a very active Discord server where people can come, but they understand what's expected of them. It's not a place for, having partisan battles. It's about, those core ideas of verification, deliberation, and accountability. It's like sharing facts, discussing them, dissecting them, using the processes we've developed. We also have our website where, we have tools, techniques, methodologies for people to learn themselves. So it's creating, the training material, the spaces, the opportunities for people to actually engage in at least online spaces. But we're also now working with universities to create course material around open source investigation in a variety of topics, and helping them create investigative hubs with their own students. So those students are learning how to do investigations into things they care about rather than being directed by Bellingcat or their tutors. And that's been successful already, and we're planning to expand that in the future.
Eliot, you had mentioned something, and I want to ask Astead and Emily this. Sometimes I think, and our show gets in this all the time, which is like the conversation often ends up being that there's a mis and disinformation crisis, and we can't platform misinformation, right? Versus there's a greater issue with institutional distrust, and how can we earn that trust back with the citizenry? I often find that that's the central tension, even in our show. And we get accused of platforming misinformation because we have all kinds of people on our show. And I wonder, Astead, can you address that? Because I do think that this debate of platforming misinformation versus rebuilding trust that institutions have lost, like, we're stuck in a spin cycle sometimes of that. And I particularly see this with the left. How do you acknowledge that?
Yeah, I think it's a huge issue. I think that, as you all are kind of identifying, there was an instinct to treat this, what I think was a worthy, earnest conversation about changing information ecosystems and misinformation and spotting all that. I think it became a partisanly weaponized. I mean, it feels a little more like people trying to hall monitor information that they want to ideologically agree with sometimes. And so this was huge, I think, in 2020, 2021. I remember when we started our podcast at the Times, the run up, and the mere fact that we were talking to Trump supporting Republicans was a huge issue for the first 6 months, 8 months, and which really blew my mind because I didn't know about a way to cover the election without it, And so I just think it had gotten to this kind of frenzy. I have always leaned personally into the idea that our trust gap was such that we needed to meet people where they were. And that does not mean, I think, stepping back from your journalistic instinct. I think particularly with people who are known purveyors of false information, there is a why burden that you have to clear. So when we had RFK Jr. on our show, like, we made sure to explain the why. We made sure to turn him down at one point and like do our this is actually what group studies have said about this on Mercury and blah 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 blah. Like, and so we have Kellyanne Conway on. We like made sure to say certain things. Like, we had Mike Lindell on, and it was about the ways conspiracies was rooted in the top levels of a Republican Party. And so there's a purpose for doing that. And then we went to Ronna McDaniel, the RNC chair, to ask her about the information we took. I think you have to ask yourself, like, the purpose of that. But there's misinformation that's not limited to just one side. And so I guess, to me, you should always be asking that question. And that should be a burden in your head just generally. And so that was the reason I always felt kind of distant from that conversation, because I think things like, and then again, I go back to politics world, think about things like birtherism. There was such a resistance to dealing with the root or the scope of that conspiracy. I actually think it causes Donald Trump to be underrated as a political figure heading into the 2016 election, because we have actual numbers about like the mass amounts of Republican caucus goers who think Barack Obama was born in, Kenya or whatever. But because it was icky, because it was like a little uncomfortable, those are things that I think gatekeepers decide that they could exist outside of. To me, a post kind of like QAnon lesson is like, those things are not true anymore. And actually the ways that those so-called conspiracies completely invalidate the other side as equal partner in democracy, to me, is a feature of this political moment. And so I wouldn't run from that stuff, more so than think legitimately creatively about how most to responsibly engage in it. But I don't think ignoring it is, to me, a journalistic option on the table.
Emily, what's your take on that? This kind of tension between platforming admitting that institutions lost trust, and which kind of camp should we be in?
Something I've always found difficult, coming from somewhere in like so-called flyover country, is when I went into media, and I've been in DC for a while, I just noticed people tend to, because it's their job, develop this sense of intellectual superiority over the average news consumer or the average voter. And I'm not even talking about like IQ distribution, but I think you become divorced from the public to the point where you develop a very patronizing relationship with, kind of the average person in a way that's actually not justified and not fair. In fact, there's a lot of research that shows the more high information a person is, the more susceptible they are to some conspiracy theories and disinformation. And that's been replicated more than once. I think we've all had that kind of experience. And so when I think about, the Tea Party era small business owner in Wisconsin who got sucked into birtherism, what I think about is how the media failed that person and did not take seriously, was not even familiar with the different parts of the rabbit trail that were being picked up on by perfectly intelligent people who have other things going on in their life and that don't trust institutions and are well-intentioned, decent human beings, but stumble into these corners just oftentimes by happenstance, or because they got an email forward at the time, or because of a Facebook post, and they didn't spend multiple hours checking it out. It came from somewhere that looked legitimate. It came from a person that looked legitimate, and it's a perfectly rational thing for a busy, normal human being to do, to look at something and say, okay, this looks legitimate. I've thought about it for 20 minutes. I don't have 2 more hours to research it. It's just getting kind of baked into my head. And it doesn't mean that people lack agency. We all have agency, and we all, should be doing what we can to make sure that we are, finding the closest version of the truth that we possibly can and making our decisions based on it. But I think what happens is that you get all of these. You're just battered over the head with fact checks, particularly if you're on the right. Battered over the head with fact checks that are not helpful, that are patronizing, that are often not even done in a way that's like fair based on left and right. How many, and I just mean in terms of selection bias. So how often is there a fact check on this side as opposed to on this side? And that's one of the things that like really, really deeply frustrates people on the right. And so you end up just not trusting anything and making these judgments as you're going through life, like, oh, okay, this looks fairly legitimate. And again, it's not saying that's right. It's just saying that people in the media make it worse often by failing to understand and take seriously and treat that person as a good faith, rational actor for getting pulled into this. And I think everyone in media had the experience during QAnon in particular of meeting a normal human being who had been seduced and sucked into that world. And a huge lesson for that is how to stop it before it happens, and to remember that rational, normal, well-intentioned people are just as smart as we are in the media. And there but for the grace of God go I, because it's your job. Have the
Emily,
luxury.
I think the lesson that I am observing that's been drawn from, we saw what happened when like just a regular Upper East Side, remember that regular Upper East Side mom that found QAnon that was like the Times headline? Mm-hmm. That the lesson has been, let's throw a lot of funding dollars into fighting misinformation. And let's throw a lot of prioritizing it in philanthropy, in big think tanks, that like the problem is misinformation. And we gotta like cut it out at its root. We got to figure out how to tell that mom that QAnon thing is just bullshit. And instead, like, do you look at that? And I'll be honest, even in conversations on the show, we've had a lot of people be like, the fight now is fighting misinformation. It's fighting in our world, it's fighting medical misinformation. How do you respond when you hear that that's where a lot of the funding priorities are going?
Yeah, I it's interesting because I see this developing, but I have never personally found that to be a winning strategy. I don't necessarily know if I have one for for folks. But I think that sort of lecturing, I think that sort of like presumptive mind change requires trust that these places don't have. And so if we don't agree on the information ecosystem, and if we don't agree on your authority as gatekeeper, then your litany of facts is not going to mean much to me. And so that's what I don't really understand about some of those efforts. I think to like Eliot's point that he made, I think previously, like, you know, a rebuilding of community spaces, I feel like is very important. Like for the work that I do, you can feel the kind of people's insideness from 2017 till now. You can feel the retrenchment from places where people come together and you can kind of ask them questions about politics or whatever. Like even the places I go in communities have gotten harder and harder to find. And so like, I think that's hugely important. You know, the part I agree with, you know, with what Emily was saying was really about like the you have to have, I think there is a belief in media sometimes that our vote matters a little more, or that there's a version of a vote that should count for double, you know, that if you vote for smart people reasons and not other ones, then somehow it's more meaningful. And I think that you have to rid yourself of that to even come to even create the space of curiosity to have an earnest dialogue with folks, right? And so in that, you can, yes, learn the factors that led someone down the path of conspiracy that are underrated. You can honestly learn about bigotry. You can learn about the factors of overt distaste for people that are bubbling among places that the folks don't talk about. But you get a more earnest discussion of where folks are coming from. And I think that that only is going to come with a curiosity and a removal of, I think, the haughtiness we're both talking about. And so I think that like I have totally seen, you know, I get questions all the time about, oh, like, how do you go to said thing as Black guy? And it blows my mind because I'm like, there's so many qualities that we have, right? Like, and also, why aren't you going? You know, is my question too. I would be embarrassed to call myself a politics reporter and not be going. And so I guess like, and so I get to me, I'm like, so much of I think what we're talking about is folks who have removed themselves from the idea that those voices matter. And in my world, particularly in electoral politics, there's been an overlean on not even like data in like a investigative way, but I think publicly available polling to supplement people's voices. And I think that has really collapsed nuance. I think that really has collapsed like the kind of why in the country's movements. And in my feeling, our political system divides and polarizes a country that is actually, I think, being forced to fit themselves into ideological boxes that don't match them. And so when you only work from the premise of polling, I think you really miss that from the people perspective. And I find that to be a real bummer of our political reporting, because I think it actually paints a picture of a country that re-entrenches said polarization more than it does helping us break free of it.
Instead, I can't, like, I just have to just say an amen to that, because it's so, you know, in the work we do where we talk to so many people who are mistrustful of the medical system, who've stopped taking vaccines, who really believe in Kennedy. And, you know, our entire mission is to understand where that comes from, like truly, and to engage in conversations. So I just want to say I really felt kind of seen and heard in what you just said. Tom, you want to
yeah, maybe this could be sort of a final question. And Eliot, I'll come to you. You know, you wrote the report on our past and our present, how we got into this place. I just want you to kind of look forward a little bit to the future and the stress test on all of this of artificial intelligence. What are you're sort of living on the frontier of this. What are you most worried about for our future, our immediate future in this information structure that we're living in right now, and the sort of the rise of artificial intelligence as like a whole nother sort of stress on this whole system?
Yeah, think of it as a stress on the system rather than the one big problem we face in the future is important. I often get asked a lot of questions about artificial intelligence, and it still exists within those systems that, you know, we already operate within. Just to go briefly back to the previous point, I think one thing that's also really, really important especially for the future, is restoring local journalism, public interest journalism at that local level, because that has been completely holed out. That is how we understand how communities are feeling. Having journalists out in the public, talking to them at that local level, actually doing things they care about. Those, to me, are more important things to restore than kind of over-focusing on new technologies that are emerging. Although, briefly, I do have one anecdote on AI encountered today. So when I talk about disordered discourse, I talk about the role of communities and algorithms in creating information that people get kind of engaged with and get sucked into these communities. What we're seeing more and more in our inbox at Bellingcat are people sending chat GPT generated, basically individually, like customized conspiracy theories with ChatGPT, actually kind of replacing the role of communities and algorithms in that process. So individuals are now kind of being drawn into their own individual disordered discourses because you have these large language models that they can interact with that reaffirm what they believe and kind of take the role of these communities, these algorithms in those disordered discourse systems.
That's scary.
Astead and Emily, as we kind of wrap here, I wonder if you can just talk to that listener who's maybe listening and a little worried about the information ecosystem and what to trust and what not to trust and feeling like just a bit overwhelmed. What would you say to that listener about how you kind of see this moment, and just that, like, maybe we don't have to all be in a fetal position rocking back and forth right now? Instead, why don't you take a crack at that?
Well, in the spirit of acknowledging distrust, I would say it's fair to feel overwhelmed. I would say it's fair to feel kind of swamped. And I think that, but to me, the priority on values like accuracy and fairness is unique amongst it, is unique enough right now, where if you're prioritizing information that passes those barriers, support it, and encourage others to do the same, I feel like is a key factor here. And honestly, I just think that because the challenges we face are so vast, I definitely feel like the team, at least in my opinion, is much larger. Like anyone who's engaged, whether it be from an institutional level or an individual level, in the process of accurate and fair information, I support. And so like, I just think that like, that's a different lens than I even had on media and journalism 4 or 5 years ago. But I think it's actually one that's much more reflective of where we are going. And so, you know, to me, I'm like, hold those standards in your head more than I am holding individual medium or individual institution in my head, because I think those rules have changed.
Emily, talk to our listener who's rocking back and forth in a fetal position right now.
Well, you have control over yourself. And I think one thing we have to adjust our expectations. We grew up, or a lot of us are used to the conditions of mass media with a fairly high level of trust. And as that's collapsed, it's been really disorienting. But amidst the disorientation, I think it's just helpful for us to recognize that we have gone from point A to point B. And that's okay. It's a function of technology. We haven't always had Walter Cronkite on the evening news through human history, soothing us with the most important stories of the day in language that felt true and accurate. So basically, we just all have to put in more time and effort. And I think that's unfortunate because I think there are things, journalists can do better. But aside from that, we're just going to have to chase down information individually. And in conversations with our family and friends, people in our community, we're going to need to that's going to have to be a kind of community function and an individual function of really doing your own research, pushing yourself to get closer and closer to the truth, reading transcripts, following the links. That's different for us because we feel like we used to be able to have a relatively high level of trust in one source or two sources or three sources. Maybe it was your local news, your local paper, and the evening news. But now it's just going to be different. And we're all going to have to develop a sort of immune system or an instinct and do the best that we can on our own and in our communities.
You said immune system. I see what you did there.
No pun intended.
There you go. No, we love talking about the immune system. Eliot Higgins, final word.
I think we are going through a difficult transition at the moment. because the information system is changing so much around us, I think there's a lack of recognition of what's actually changing as well. And I think having conversations like this in the public, having people listening to, what these challenges actually are rather than the kind of surface level symptoms of these challenges is something that's really important. There are lots of ways for people to engage with the kind of work that we do at Bellingcat in terms of, crowdsourced open source investigations. And if you want to get involved, please do. But I think it's important also to keep an open mind when you're talking to people. I think we've often just slide into kind of partisan politics far too often. And it's been really great to have this conversation today where we've just been able to talk about things sensibly and discuss the issues. And I think it's great to see that we all, I think, broadly agree on them.
Well, I am just so grateful to you guys for joining. Truly, we are huge fans of you all. We talk about you all behind your backs in really good ways, just because you help us clarify and think through this world we're living in. So Emily Jashinsky, Astead Herndon, Eliot Higgins, thank you so much for joining us on Why Should I Trust You?
Thank you.
Thank you.
So that was our episode today. I am Brenda Adhikari. He's Tom Johnson. Next week is Thanksgiving. So I don't know. We'll see what we do. Maybe we'll sing a song for you guys or something. I don't really know. But we want to thank you so much. Send us questions and comments at questions@whyshoulditrustyou.net. And we'll see you guys around. Thank you.